We have an interesting program today where we're going to be looking at an issue that is extremely topical, how authoritarian regimes, how authoritarian governments are attempting to interfere with our democracy and others around the world. I'm going to introduce our panelists. First of all, our co-moderator is Professor James F. Hollifield. Jim Hollifield is Academic Director at the Tower Center over at SMU. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a Global Fellow at the Wilson Institute in Washington. He served as an advisor to governments around the world, worked with the United Nations, the World Bank, the OECD, and a host of other international organizations. In addition to teaching here at SMU, he's taught at other universities across the United States and in Europe as well. And then our two panelists. Laura Rosenberger is Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She was Foreign Policy Advisor for Hillary Clinton's campaign, where she coordinated the campaign's national security policies, messaging, and strategy. Prior to that, she worked in a series of national security posts in the Obama administration, including at the National Security Council, worked for the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and a host of other senior positions. She has a lot of expertise, in particular on Asia. Laura and I appeared on the same stage just 3 days ago in Washington talking about North Korea, another topic that's been in the news a little bit lately. So, Laura, we're delighted to have you here. And then with her is Jamie Fly, who is co-director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Jamie was counselor for Foreign and National Security Affairs for Senator Marco Rubio, a senior advisor to his presidential campaign during the 2016 era. Prior to that, he was executive director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, which is a Washington-based think tank starting in 2009. He also served in President Bush's administration on the National Security Council, advising on things like counter-proliferation. So, Jamie, welcome as well. Again, thank you, everybody. We're gonna have a conversation for about a half hour, and then we'll open up the floor to all of you. We're grateful for you being here, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you. So Jamie and Laura, to start off, Hillary Clinton, Marco Rubio. These are kind of strange bedfellows. What does it tell us about the nature of this threat? Why don't you open up? What are we talking about when we talk about authoritarian threats to our democracy?
So thank you again, Lindsay, for the warm welcome, and to Jim and to both the Bush Center and the Tower Center for hosting us here. We're really thrilled to be down here. It's a little warmer than it is in Washington right now, so we thank you for that as well. So I think it's a really excellent place to start, Lindsay, because when I think about my career in national security and dealing with the challenges that we face to our country, to me, national security is never something that should be a partisan issue. I actually, you heard mostly about my time in the Obama administration working for Hillary Clinton, but I joined the State Department in 2004 when Colin Powell was Secretary of State. I joined as a civil servant. I joined because I believed that even though my political views may have been different, that protecting our country's security is something that doesn't actually have partisan lines. And in the past few years, as we've watched Russia in particular, but other powers as well, start to adopt new tools of attacking our countries by attacking our democracies, our institutions, as means of weakening us. To me, this was obviously another national security threat, and one that I believed we didn't really have the tools necessary to effectively counter these attacks on our institutions. And I knew as well that to effectively counter this particular threat, it was especially imperative to do this in a bipartisan way. And one of the reasons why I think it's particularly important, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more, is that one of the ways that we see the Russian operations manifesting in our country over the past few years, and as we see them manifest across Europe, they try to divide us from each other. They are actually using our divisions. I would argue they're using our hyperpartisanship at times, our polarization, as means of actually weakening us. And the only way that we can actually address this problem is by coming together across party lines to be able to find shared solutions that will help strengthen our country from within and protect it from threats from without. So that's how Jamie and I ended up together, working on this program.
Jamie, you disagree with all of that, I hope?
Exactly, everything. No, it's a great honor to be here. I'm a proud alum of the Bush administration. got my start in politics on President Bush's re-election in 2004, then went on to serve in the administration. And I was thinking yesterday when we got here, if you would have told me that my first visit here to the Bush Institute and Library would be with a former Hillary Clinton staffer back in 2009, January, when I left the Bush administration, I would have thought you were insane, and I would not have believed it. You know, I had worked with Democrats before on a number of issues, but when I met Laura, we were both coming to the German Marshall Fund in 2017 and had just both come off of the 2016 campaign. The project that Laura had begun to conceive really was appealing to me because of what I had seen working for Senator Rubio. Obviously, Senator Rubio did not get as far as Secretary Clinton in the campaign, but the way that the campaign unfolded and the way that both manipulation of social media, this attempt to really weaponize our democracy, played out through hacks of people's emails, selective leaks of documents, which then were basically amplified by the mainstream media in the US for political advantage of one side or the other. That was deeply disturbing. Just watching that, my boss, Senator Rubio at the time, was one of the few Republicans, I think, who spoke out and said, I'm not going to comment about anything in John Podesta's emails, because John Podesta today, it's going to be any one of us tomorrow. I think there should have been more Republicans that spoke out and took that position at the time, because I think we should have seen what was potentially coming down the road. But the other reason I was very interested in this is because of my work in the Bush administration and then subsequently on issues promoting human freedom, democracy and human rights. President Bush, many others, had been trying to support democracy in fledgling places that were still developing democracy, in repressive societies. And I think authoritarians like Vladimir Putin, obviously, were very insecure, did not like some of those tactics, and they decided to try to turn some of that back on us. And the frustrating thing for me is I do think the battle lines have shifted to a certain extent. It used to be that we were having these debates about democracy in Russia, how to better support nascent opposition movements there, stand by courageous dissidents, and now we have to go on the defensive to a certain extent because of how bad the situation has gotten. And so that's what we've tried to build the alliance around, as a bipartisan response to this, to raise awareness, to push policy change in Washington, but also just to build more understanding about this challenge in society, because ultimately that is the best way to defend and respond to this threat.
Great, thank you. Jim.
Well, I just want to echo Lindsay's welcome to everyone in the room here. I see a lot of friends and familiar faces, Tower Center members, board members, and sitting out here on the wings, we actually have some of my students who have a class with me this morning. So I hope that before the day is over, we can break down the generation gap and you'll have a chance to interact a little bit with these students. But I was talking to Lindsay the other day and looking around in this room here. Lindsay and I are old enough to remember the Cold War. Remember that? So what I'd like to do is ask a couple of questions to sort of set up the audience discussion later on. And I always consider myself sort of a failed historian, if there are any historians in the room, but an old Greek colleague of mine once said, history is the mother of us all. So I want to start with a historical question. What is new under the sun? I mean, you know, during the Cold War, we had constant campaigns of disinformation. I spent many years of my life living and working in Europe. Europe was an ideological battleground between the Soviets and the Americans. So we were in a constant struggle, you know, to try to secure democracy, secure the Western alliance. So my first question to both of our guests today, based on this expansive report you've done, is what has changed? What is different? You know, how did we end up on the defensive in this situation?
It's an excellent question. I point to two different things, and you're exactly right, that a lot of the tactics that we see, particularly in the space of information operations, but even sort of corruption, attempts to buy off, you know, in the European space, for instance, just last week, a story broke reporting that one of the sort of liberal populist parties in Italy, in advance of the European Parliament elections, was receiving kickbacks through an energy deal, a cutout there. You know, a lot of that kind of stuff is not exactly new. What I would say is new or different are two things. One is technology. So you have two different elements there. One, cyber attacks to steal information were possible during the Cold War, right? If you wanted to actually go steal information and then either use it to better inform your espionage efforts or to actually weaponize in some way, you had to physically go, you had to recruit a human spy and go and actually steal the material. That's a lot more resource intensive. You can't do it at scale. Now you have two massive well-known hacking networks just from Russia. And by the way, the Chinese are doing this kind of stuff too, with some pretty sophisticated cyber operations, the Iranians and North Koreans. So the ability to steal and then potentially weaponize materials through cyber means is one piece of it, as well as on top of that, one of the worries when it comes specifically to elections is the question of actually in some way interfering in the electoral process, whether that's with the voting machines themselves, whether that's manipulation of voter rolls. Again, cyber tools there provide a whole different vector that didn't exist in the Cold War. And then you have the social media or the online information ecosystem. Again, propaganda newsletters and all kinds of propaganda magazines were common during the Cold War, but they had to be printed in hard copies and they had to be distributed through physical networks. Now you can take things to an entirely different scope and scale. And with the use of algorithms and what's often called in this space computational propaganda, it's not even just about actually injecting something that's false or fake, but it's actually about sort of distorting the information ecosystem. So taking an issue that may be kind of marginal in normal debate, but artificially amplifying it to make it seem far more prevalent, thereby sort of creating further polarization, radicalization. So that's one dimension. And then I will note one other historical dimension that I think is important in retrospect is that, and this goes back to Jamie's point on how the battle lines have shifted here. In 1989 and soon thereafter, we declared the end of history. We had won the Cold War. Democracy was the path forward. It was inevitable, and we concluded that where democracy was, we came up with this parlance about consolidated democracies, and it was all about expanding the democratic space, but we forgot that democracy is an ongoing project. It's never finished, and we forgot to do the hard work in our own democracies to maintain it. And so we put our guard down, and as Jamie said, Putin has realized this.
Yeah, I think a large part of it is, I'll get to the technology in a minute, but a big part of it is where Laura ended. I think that we as Americans, as Western democracies, have lost our confidence in ourselves to a large extent. Some of it is the post-'89 narrative. I think here in the US, a lot of it is the post-9/11 narrative. And Americans, I think, perhaps aren't as engaged, aren't as protective of their democracy as they should be, which provided these vulnerabilities. And so a lot of the work that we've done with the blueprint and with the Alliance is trying to identify the vulnerabilities and just lay them out there so we can try to close off some of them, either some through government actions, some through societal resilience. And it's not even just to deter against Putin, because at the end of the day, one of the concerning things that we've seen even in the last year and a half that we've been working on this is a proliferation of these tactics to other authoritarian actors. We've even seen some US allies and partners who are not democracies, mostly in the Gulf, adopting some of these tactics to advance their state goals. And so you're seeing more and more countries kind of realize that democracies have these inherent vulnerabilities that can be exploited, which are incredibly troubling. The other aspect, though, on technology, I just think that's the fundamental difference. Previously in the Cold War, it was high cost, low impact tactics. Now it's low cost, high impact to do a lot of things on social media. And I think all of us have seen this through our lives. I'm not that old, but I remember when I was a news junkie in middle school watching Dan Rather 6 p.m. evening news to get my news. That's not how my kids are going to get their news, who are now 8 and 7. And I don't even know, right? The other scary thing for those of us who are parents is, we know how young people get their news, or we think we know how they get their news and information these days. But for kids who aren't even 10 yet, we have no idea technologically how they're going to be receiving news and information even 5, 10 years from now. We've talked and looked a lot about Facebook and Twitter, but many of these platforms may not even exist at that point 5 years from now. Or if they still exist, they'll be the MySpace of that era, which a few people will remember, but no one will use. And so this is a rapidly changing landscape, and our societal norms, I don't think, have evolved as quickly as the technology has evolved. And so at the end of the day, that means that a lot of what you need to do to respond to these challenges is just to educate, especially young people, to raise more awareness about the problem and about what's being thrown at them online. And you can't make it a platform-specific or a technology-specific response, which is a major challenge, because at the end of the day, it means that this is a whole-of-society approach that needs to be adopted to deal with these threats.
Can you give us a couple of, an example or two? We've heard about social media, we've heard about traditional media. Can you give us just a few examples of how adversaries have used both the traditional media and the social media to advance their agendas?
So one of my favorite examples that cuts across a couple different streams here actually comes from Texas in advance of the 2016 election. There were two Facebook groups that were created by what's known as the Internet Research Agency. It's the often sort of shorthanded St. Petersburg troll farm that was creating all these sock puppet accounts, these fake accounts, pretending to be Americans, but actually were individuals sitting in St. Petersburg being paid by a very good friend of Vladimir Putin. And so they created these two fake pages. One was called The Heart of Texas, and it was focused on basically preserving white Christian Texan values, but in a way that was very anti-Islam. It was very much focused on keeping out the Islamization of Texas, and in some ways it was also sort of a pro-Texas secessionist group as well. It sort of espoused some of those views. And then there was another group, and I forget the exact name off the top of my head, but it was a group that was speaking out in favor of Muslim rights, and believing that in fact we are a country with freedom of religion and welcoming of immigrants, and so these should be the rights that we champion. And these two groups were set up. They collected followers on Facebook, and then they both started organizing rallies, same date, same time, opposite sides of the street, outside of a mosque. Neither group knew that one was the counter to the other. They were being organized separately. And these two protests actually happened, and people showed up. And a lot of analysts believe that the actual goal may have not just been to get people to show up and shout at each other, but potentially to foment violence. And fortunately, law enforcement was there. They kept people apart. But this actually, these people showed up to this event because they genuinely believed on the two different, in the two different messages that were being espoused by these groups. They had no idea that they were organized to be there by Russian trolls paid by Putin's friends sitting in St. Petersburg. These are Americans who would not have come together on opposite sides of the street to yell at each other had they not been recruited, organized, and I would say manipulated on social media to show up at that place. So I use that example a lot because I think it's really important in underscoring that the multiple dimensions of this. We often, fake news was sort of what was often shorthanded in the original kind of descriptions of what the Russians did. It was so much more complicated than that. It is so much more complicated than that because, by the way, they're still doing this. And what happens online doesn't stay online is one of the things I often say about this. I think there's I've heard a lot of arguments from people who say, yeah, but it's just the false reality of the internet. Well, the reality is we all live. Our reality is being created at this point by the online space. So that's one example.
Yeah, the interesting thing about as we've gotten this project underway is we've looked at different ways to educate Americans about this. We've had different trackers and dashboards and looking, and at a certain point, I was just struck. We realized it's almost every major political issue that emerges in our society. They find a way to try to jump and bandwagon on it one way or the other. Whether it's a school shooting, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the take a knee controversy. we've seen evidence that the Russians in particular have tried to exploit that. And it matches up to what we've seen in Europe as well. GMF is a transatlantic organization. We have several staffers now working on this project for us in Europe. And as we've gone to various European partners and talked to them about what they've faced both during the Cold War and now, the amazing thing is how sophisticated, especially the Russian effort has been. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach that they apply to every democracy. It's incredibly insidious. They look at the vulnerabilities within each country, whether it's a certain minority group, and there are issues related to that minority group in that particular country, and they'll try to exacerbate that divide within society. And I think that's one of the failures maybe that the US government made over the years. I know as someone who had worked in government, and including on Russia, doing arms control during the Bush administration, I never thought the Russians were sophisticated enough to understand American politics to the extent that we now realize that they've, I guess we at the end of the day were more of an open book than many of us realized, and easier to understand and easier to figure out kind of what buttons to push in our debate on both the left and right. And that's the other key takeaway for me, is that this is, I call it equal opportunity. Unfortunately, in the media, there's this narrative that all this is about potential Trump collusion with Russia and the Mueller investigation. If you look at what they're doing, it doesn't support one side or the other. They will infiltrate a group on the left just as easily and quickly as they will a group on the right. They're really not about politics for the most part. They just want people to be, Americans to be angry at each other, to be fighting, to be arguing, sometimes in very almost violent ways. That's their ultimate goal, to knock us off course and to sow this instability. And we've seen that across the board in every instance that has popped up in the tracking that we've done.
There's a great book, I don't know if any of you've read it, by a German-Austrian philosopher called Karl Popper. It's entitled The Open Society and Its Enemies. And you know, we do have an open society here. We are a little bit of an open book. And I think one of the objectives of our adversaries is to get us to close our society. So how do we avoid, you know, falling into that trap? You know, not reacting in such a way that we start going down a more authoritarian, autocratic path, taking away freedoms and liberties. How do you strike that balance?
I think it's exactly right. It's something Jamie and I have talked a lot about from the get-go, is that really strengthening our democracy from within, strengthening our institutions is one of the best ways of making them resilient, but that the response, the easy response often is taking steps that might impinge on speech,
Yep.
or might impinge on assembly. And I think that's where, number one, we have to be really careful. We've done a lot of work trying to push the social media platforms in particular to take this problem seriously. And one of the things I think it's how I think about this problem is if we think about it from the content perspective, if we think about going after the end point, the messaging, then we're done for a couple reasons. One, you know, we're inherently you know, undermining our free speech rights, which I believe are so core to everything that we are as a country. But two is we're going to be perpetually playing whack-a-mole. I mean, it's just not an effective strategy. There are networks that are the ones that are continuing to push these messages. There are systemic patterns to these operations. And if we go at the problem at the source, right? If we go at the people, the trolls in St. Petersburg and elsewhere that are creating these messages, right? You know, then we can have a much more effective, more systemic approach, and B, you know, it has nothing then to do with the free speech rights of Americans. One of the things that's worrying to me, though, is I think in part because some of the platforms have started to realize that they're heavily under the gun by Congress, and because sometimes the easy fix is to just go after the content that they've identified and take it down. I think that we have started to get into a fuzzy space sometimes where at least people feel that their speech is being undermined. And one of the last things I'd say on this is, as we're looking ahead at what's happening now and what we think will continue to happen in the future on these operations, is that we see the Russian networks doing a lot more work to embed themselves more deeply with real, particularly activist communities. So whereas in 2016, what we saw a lot was the creation of these fake pages that I talked about, what we now see more of is individuals reaching out to individual activists and essentially recruiting them to say, well, why don't you do this and create this and push for this? And so then it's more authentic, and it's a real American who's actually doing something. They don't know they're doing it at the behest, they think the person on the other end of that communication is another American activist. They don't know it's a Russian troll. But that gets far more complicated in the speech questions, and I think one of our frustrations in Washington is the policy conversations about this are highly simplistic, and I think we need to be having a much more nuanced conversation. But there are a lot of things we can do that don't have to get at the speech questions, right? So if we think about the porousness of our financial system, I mentioned this case in Italy that we've just seen, and I think we know there's been one indictment so far of a woman who was operating covertly as an agent of the Russian state, being paid by a Russian oligarch to engage in outreach within the United States. And looking at what we can learn from Europe, guesses are there's probably more of that activity here. We can do a lot to strengthen our anti-money laundering regimes in the United States, for instance, which, by the way, I would argue are really good for our democracy, right? Eliminating corruption and kleptocracy would be a democracy strengthening step. Hardening our cybersecurity, doesn't have, implications in the way that I think some of the questions around speech do. So I think there is a lot that we can do.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges we've had talking to the Europeans about their experiences is many of them have a vastly different legal structure than we do. For instance, in Germany, it's just illegal to say certain things because of the Nazi past. And they've taken a very different approach in their dealings with some of the social media companies, and I think there's no way the U.S. will ever head in that direction and should not head in that direction.
Yep, hate speech is illegal.
Yes, and so we don't have those tools, and I think that's something that we should celebrate. So it makes it more challenging, though. I think at the end of the day, our products have been interesting in that we haven't gone the normal route of most bipartisan projects, task forces in Washington, where we put together a list of 20 bills that should be passed. Now, we have a few pieces of legislation that we advocate for and are supportive of, but honestly, we don't think most of this can be fixed by Congress because of these free speech issues. For me, a big part, it's been interesting to watch this play out as more awareness has been raised, as the social media companies, which were behind the curve in 2016, finally tried to start responding. I think some of them overreacted. They were very nervous about the regulatory debate in Washington and the pressure they were under from the public as well. You had people canceling their accounts in some cases. Stock prices suffered. I think some of them overcompensated by going too far and shutting down too many accounts, including some that probably were not even foreign tied. But the biggest challenge that they've all had is they aren't honest and upfront about their actual rules of the road. If you're a user of these accounts, you don't know how the algorithms work. You don't know why you see a certain piece of information, or you see a certain friend's post but not another one that did post something but isn't high in your news feed. And that's incredibly frustrating, I think, for your average users of many of these social media platforms. Then when you're an activist and your account gets shut down and you don't believe that your group has been infiltrated by the Russians or by some other foreign actor, you get very angry because you think that these companies are censoring you. And if you're American, you shouldn't be censored. I mean, you have a right to say whatever you want, even if it's something against the government or that's pro-Russia. And so this debate we've watched this debate play out very similar ways on both the left and the right. It's been fascinating to see. Conservatives think that they're being censored by the social media companies. Progressives think they're being censored, all for very different reasons. But that has also, I think, made some of the response more difficult because it's made many people just suspicious of this whole narrative that there is interference, and they question whether the Russians are even involved at all. And so at the end of the day, I think the companies could best address this by being much more clear about what their rules are for content, what their rules are for pages, whether if you have a foreign affiliation, how you declare that and what's allowed, and being more clear about algorithm transparency, which the companies have been jealously guarding. They don't want you to know why certain content appears at certain times, partly because that's the key to their profit making and how they sell your data, and everyone else's to advertisers. But I think ultimately that's the real way to address a lot of these issues with the companies.
We've talked a lot about media, but one of the areas that concerns me are our election systems.
Mm-hmm.
We have, I think, a uniquely decentralized system in the U.S. where the way that the lists are maintained, the way you physically cast your ballot is different from county to county, state to state. What are some of the challenges we face in terms of the potential for foreign manipulation of our elections?
Yeah, this has been an interesting experience for me too, because some of my main interaction with our electoral system goes back to 2004 and President Bush's re-election, when I got deployed to Cuyahoga County in Ohio for the last 5 weeks of the campaign and dealt with a lot of the state and local elections boards. And you're right, in some respects our disorganized, decentralized, underfunded, by the way, system actually is an advantage here because there is not one central node, for the most part, that could be exploited by a foreign actor. You do have things like state voter rolls and databases, which we need to protect. But there are troubling signs that we've seen. We've seen a whole host of kind of postmortems in 2016, which looked at Russian probing of certain states. I think Texas was on that list that the DHS came up with, where they did see some signs that there was an attempt to maybe exploit some systems. I think in the Texas case, from what I had read, it was a public-facing database, so it wasn't actually the key voter registration database. So even if it had been exploited, they couldn't actually change anyone. But it's a whole host of issues, from the security of the voting machines to the actual voter rolls. And you could wreak a lot of havoc depending on, even just slightly changing certain names and how you go about this on elections day. You can create lines in polling places. You can get it to the point where the system clogs up, which is already a problem in certainly many urban areas already that are, these local boards have been underfunded and don't have enough voting machines, and people just give up and decide it's not worth their trouble to vote. The other thing which we've seen, which is very concerning, which they did in 2016 on social media as well, is fan the flames of this skepticism about whether voting even matters, whether your vote is counted, whether the system is secure. We've actually seen some evidence the Russians are trying to just, even if they're not touching the voting system, they're trying to push a narrative on social media that don't bother voting because it doesn't matter, it can never be read, it never be tallied. And so we've seen a lot of attempts to try to undermine this. We've been supportive of a bipartisan effort in Congress called the Secure Elections Act, which would not be a federal takeover of the voting system, but would just make sure that the federal government is providing more financial support to the states that need extra help, more technical assistance, more security clearances for state and local officials. A big challenge has been that you've seen, and this happened with my old boss, Senator Rubio in Florida, you've seen a debate between federal officials. You had Senator Rubio and then Senator Nelson trying to tell the local officials in Florida, hey, you guys have a problem. We've seen some intelligence that suggests that Florida is a target, and the state and local officials say, no, we're completely secure. We've seen evidence of that, partly because the local officials don't have the security clearances to actually get the intelligence shared with them. So there are initiatives like that underway in Washington that we're very supportive of, which we think could have a major impact in moving this ball forward and making sure that people's votes are actually protected and everyone who wants to is able to participate.
Yeah, I'd just briefly add 2 points. One is, to me, this actually is an area where there's an easier answer, and it's available and it's right there. And partisan gridlock is essentially keeping this from moving forward in Washington, and that's deeply frustrating. And so I'll just sort of leave that there. But the second piece of it is that I think it really gets at why we need to look at this issue systemically too. Jamie mentioned some of the narratives we see about voting being pushed by Russian linked information operations. We also know that there's signs that in previous elections, one of the things they've been prepared to do was basically plant stories alleging that there was some kind of manipulation of the vote count. And if they do that in a state where you don't have, for instance, a paper ballot backup system that can be audited, you may have doubts about the entire integrity of the election. And one of the things that, in so many things in our democracy, but certainly true about elections, it rests on trust, right? We have peaceful transfers of power even in elections that are disputed, right? Even where there's questions of hanging chads and things like that, because we, at the end of the day, have trust in our systems and we believe in the integrity of our institutions.
So far.
So far. And if that begins to be meaningfully, if doubt begins to be meaningfully cast on that, then we have much deeper problems. And so I think it's really important that we understand that in some ways it's not even, you don't actually have to have any large-scale manipulation to change things. Even just serious doubts being injected about whether there was manipulation of any kind of piece of the voting system could inject, real challenges into our democracy.
Okay, I know we're going to go to discussion in a minute. I see a lot of very anxious-looking, eager faces out there, but we got time for one more round of questions here. I would encourage all of you, if you get time, go online and look at the report. It's there. It's a very detailed report, and let our guests know what you think about it. But one of the things that struck me, much of the report is taken up by looking at the different players, the different actors, the kind of responses, where they will come from. You have the government. You mentioned there's no partisanship in this issue, right?
Shouldn't be.
We all know politics always stops at the water's edge, at least that's what they used to say. You talk about alliances. I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about that. Are we coordinating carefully with our alliance partners, especially in Europe? You mentioned the private sector. You've touched on that. You also mentioned, I know, Bill McKenzie and some others in the room here who were members of the Third Estate, the media. What's the media's responsibility in this? And then finally, you mentioned civil society. So I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different levels of response, and each of those sectors you talk about how the response should be formulated. Could you tell us which is more important? Where should we be putting our emphasis? And just go through those a little bit for us.
Yeah, Jamie mentioned this earlier, is what we talk about as the whole of society approach. And I'm going to give a slightly cop-out answer, which is they're all equally important, and you knew that was coming. But it's the reality, right? I mean, it's government at the federal, state, local level. It's the private sector, whether that's the tech companies themselves, whether, frankly, I think, we've seen, I think the business community become much more active on a whole host of different social issues in the past few years. I think this is an area where, our the free enterprise, right, really relies on rule of law and political freedom for it to function well. And so I think, business community playing a more active role as custodians of our democracy could be quite powerful. Media, you mentioned, and Lindsay asked earlier about how the Russians use social media and the more traditional media. I'd note we did a whole piece last year on responsible reporting in an era of irresponsible information. Yes. And essentially the idea, we took a look back at, one of the biggest channels for Russian disinformation being injected into the American electorate in 2016 was the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And it was, the contents of emails that had been stolen from the DNC or from John Podesta or other campaign figures or apparatus, and then was leaked online, promoted through sock puppet accounts, and then printed on the front page of newspapers or reported on CNN. And that was known at that time that was information stolen by the Russians. There was no doubt about where that information how it had ended up there. And so I think, there's been a lot of conversation amongst journalists after that experience about whether that is something they should have done. A number of prominent journalists have expressed regret for the fact that they talked so much not just about the fact of the hacking, the fact of the release of the information, but that they reported on the weaponized content, which is, by the way, exactly what the Russians wanted to happen. And by the way, that hack was conducted by what's known as the GRU. It was Russian military intelligence. That was an operation that was a military operation against the United States of America. So I think that that's an area where, you know, media can play I'm certainly hoping, a much more responsible role in handling weaponized information as we go forward. But civil society, pause for 1 second, because it is hugely important and often overlooked. I mean,
That's all of us in this room.
yeah, absolutely. And you know, civil society plays an enormous role in, if we go back to what I was saying earlier about the daily work of a democracy, right? It's never done. It's something that's always a process, and that's where civil society is really, really key. One of the things we've learned from studying both the Cold War experience and the more recent European experience on the front lines is that building resiliency in any targeted population is really the most effective way to reducing the impact of any of these kinds of operations. Inoculation, essentially. And whether that's through media and digital literacy, whether that's through broad-based awareness about threats, whether that's through renewed civic education. I mean, if you look at the polling numbers, I mean, Lindsay, you know this well, the polling numbers on, you know, faith in democracy or belief that democracy is the best system of government, they're declining in ways that are deeply worrying in the US and in Europe, and particularly if we look generationally. So I think there's an enormous amount of really good work that could be done there.
I'll just briefly on alliances. I think it's been striking to us as we've engaged European partners on this challenge, many of whom have faced this for years, or even right around the same time as 2016, gone through their own high-profile elections. If you look at the election of Emmanuel Macron in France, where you had a data dump in the final hours of the campaign that was tied to the Russians. You had infiltration of German databases and potential German or Russian support for the far right AfD. The striking thing to us, and we've briefed NATO ambassadors and talked to NATO and the EU. Honestly, on this issue, which should bring us together because it's this shared challenge, not just from Russia, but China and others down the road. Because the Russians are so effective in particular at striking these very sensitive chords within our society, many governments actually don't want to talk about it with other governments. We found this early on when we briefed NATO and we were asking staff there, has the US really come over and given a post-mortem about what our intelligence agencies and law enforcement found in 2016? Have the French come and shared with you, all of NATO allies, what happened in the Macron election? Because there was a lot of this in the press. And what we ended up finding out is a lot of governments tended to do this on a one-to-one. The French would brief the Germans very quietly through intelligence channels, or the US would quietly engage one partner or the other. They didn't want to have a whole of alliance conversation about this, partly because it was embarrassing. That was my sense. On some of these, whether it's race or these ethnic minority issues in certain countries that the society had not addressed, which were then exploited. And so that was troubling to us. So there's been progress now, and NATO, I think, is trying to take this more seriously. It's set up several centers of excellence on different issues related to this challenge, a hybrid threat center, as a cyber center as well. There's a lot more that can be done through those alliance structures. And the other important aspect of this is, as we've delved into some of the social media tactics that the Russians use in Europe and here in the US, what we found is a big part of their agenda, I mean, a lot of it's domestic often and exacerbating the societal divides. They are also trying to push messages to pull the US and Europe apart. We have found evidence of certain anti-European messaging in US social media, certain images of Europe essentially as a terrorist wasteland filled with Muslim immigrants that Europe cannot handle, pushing in very vivid terms that narrative, which then gets recycled and sometimes gets picked up in different media outlets.
There's a divide and conquer strategy.
Exactly. They do the same thing about US policy, and they portray the US in a certain light in European countries. And so that's also part of their strategy, is to literally break apart the alliance. And so we think it's incredibly important that institutions like NATO, or even as the US engages with the EU, that this be high on the agenda. And so one thing we're actually doing in the next few months is we're going to put out a European version of the document you've been referring to that's aimed more at a European audience, especially as we see European parliamentary elections coming up, we see other national elections in Europe that are potentially at risk, because we actually think that there needs to be this common transatlantic approach and a common transatlantic understanding of the problem, and I don't think we're quite there yet.
We have copies of the report for you on your way out. Wow. So make sure you pick up one of those as you're leaving us today. Devil's advocate question. Putin has railed for years that the U.S. has manipulated things in Russia. We have tried to handpick the leaders of Ukraine, of Georgia, of other things like that. How is this any qualitatively different? That the U.S. has certain foreign policy goals, seeks to advance those overseas. Is there really a difference of kind here, or is it we do the same thing?
Jamie's favorite question. So we get this a lot, and I think it's a really important question for us to understand, especially for those of us who do believe that American democracy promotion is a really important piece of U.S. foreign policy and something we should be continuing to do. I'd point to a couple of different pieces of it that make this different. One is, what we do is, very open and transparent. Our support for activists, for democratic forces in different countries, small d democratic, is something that we are very open about and we're very transparent about. And so that's number one, a big distinction with what we see Putin doing, which is very covert and the opposite of transparency. Two is that on a lot of the technical assistance kind of programs, for instance, that the International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute, National Endowment for Democracy do, they offer that kind of assistance regardless of political ideology, right? Those kinds of assistance programs, those capacity building programs, are available to any political party in the countries where they operate. They're not choosing sides, if you will. And number three, and to me, what's perhaps the most important distinction here, is that the U.S. democracy promotion efforts are aimed at building and strengthening institutions. And what Putin is doing is aimed at weakening and breaking those institutions. And in that sense, they are polar opposites of one another. We could get into more of the specifics about, we're empowering voices to be authentic within, they're silencing voices, all that stuff. But I think that for me, that sort of broad frame, we're building, they're destroying, that to me is kind of the most important piece of it.
Yeah, I think Laura's covered most of it. I mean, the other thing I think it's important to highlight, because some of our broadcast efforts, for instance, often get compared to RT, or now you have Chinese, every authoritarian regime has their own TV channel now broadcasting in English in many cases. If the Russians just wanted to leave it at RT, I'd be fine with that. I mean, if Americans want to sit and watch RT and get their news and information from RT, that's their right. But what we've seen them do is they don't want to stop at that. They now are trying to, exploit YouTube. So videos that actually are Russian produced, sometimes by RT, they strip off the labeling to show the origin of the videos, and they game the algorithm on YouTube. So when you search, for Ukraine, NATO on YouTube, there's a decent chance you're going to get some Russian-produced content high up in that result, and you, as an American consumer of that information, may not know the agenda of the people who originally produced it. If they were overt about all of this on social media and they wanted to just put up more and more Russia Today accounts on social media and push out information, I'd be fine with that. But a lot of it is this effort to then mask themselves as average Americans who are honestly just engaging in political debate and exploit the rights that we all have to engage in that political debate. And so that's a fundamental difference, I think, in terms of the sort of democracy promotion or the broadcasting work that the US government sponsors. It's fairly overt. It may be quietly done in certain sensitive cases when people's lives are at risk and things like that, but it's a fundamentally different approach to engaging in this space between what we see from the Russians and what we see from the US government.
Do we open it up, or do you want to keep going?
Maybe I'll ask one more question. Just we're sitting on a college campus today here at SMU. Talk a little bit about how some of these adversaries, China in particular, may be attempting to influence college students and how they view the world. Some of those efforts.
None of my students here would be silly enough to fall.
No, of course not.
Laura has done a lot of work on this too, but I'll start. I actually worry, at the end of the day, we've talked a lot about, we always fall into the trap, but we always say, well, it's broader than Russia, but we end up spending almost all our time talking about Russia because there's so many immediate examples. I personally am much more concerned about this challenge vis-a-vis China in the long run than I am about Russia. I mean, I think Russia is a declining power, you know, I think that Russia has all kinds of economic, demographic challenges, and at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin is just desperately trying to stay relevant, maintain his grip on power, throw us off balance, and he's doing an amazing job of it, given the hand he currently has. China is a whole nother story entirely, and I think there are some similarities, certainly about the vulnerabilities they're going to try to exploit, but they've got a lot more going for them in terms of the image they can present to the world, both economically, even culturally to a certain extent. And so I think we really need to understand that threat, and we need to realize that it's going to be presented in a very different way from the sort of conspiracy theories and the fomenting instability that we see in the Russian toolkit. And so on the college campus, I mean, there's been a lot of commentary in Washington about things like Confucius institutes, which, and I know this is a challenge that many universities have. Funding is sparse.
Could you explain what a Confucius Institute is?
These are institutes which are, at the end of the day, linked back to the Chinese Communist Party. They are basically funded at kind of partnerships to fund China studies, sometimes language studies, Asian studies. And they're prevalent in the US and in Europe. And I run our Asia program at GMF, and as I talk to European colleagues, I mean, there's a Confucius Institute in almost every European country. And in many of these places, there's not a lot of other alternative funding to do real study of Asia and Mandarin language skills. And it's a challenge now because what ends up happening is it sounds great, it looks like it's going to be good for the students, but what often happens in these cases is there's a political agenda tied to this money that's not made clear up front. So then a Confucius Institute is set up, they have students participate in various activities, but when a student or someone wants to do a program on Taiwan or on human rights in Xinjiang in China, suddenly it becomes clear that there were other understandings from the Chinese side about what was allowed here. And so preserving academic freedom, I think, is key, and making sure that any funding that's accepted does not come with some sort of other condition is a major challenge. I don't think we should just focus on that, though. I mean, this is a problem in Washington that we're beginning to look into. Chinese money in general, and whether it's think tanks, whether it's trips for members of Congress or former members of Congress, lobbying. These are all, again, vulnerabilities that are exploited by many countries to try to influence our politics. But at the end of the day, I think being smart about what the agenda is of a particular institution that says they just want to promote US-China cooperation, doing some research into the people affiliated with it, and making sure that it doesn't stifle debate is very key, especially when it comes to college campuses.
Yeah, I'd add 2 points building off of what Jamie said. One is, I think when we think about the tactics that the Chinese Communist Party is using and will be using going forward to undermine democracies outside their border, in many cases it's the same tools, but they're deployed to a different end. I mean, Russia's playing the short game. It's that destructive piece I talked about earlier. Beijing is playing a much longer game, so they're much more subtle in the way they go about things. They may be trying to weaken elements of the current democratic order, but not because they want to break it, just because they want to be able to rebuild it in a way advantageous to the Chinese Communist Party. So doing that means a lot more subtlety. Their information operations tend to be much more about sort of what I talk about as denying the information space. So rather than injecting content, whether that's polarizing or false information or whatever, into the debate, they deny the ability to speak on or engage on topics that they think should just be out of bounds. And they sometimes do that through things like the Great Firewall, which they've now started extending outside their borders. So there are certain Chinese platforms, whether it's chat apps or other kinds of online platforms where the party censors now censor content well outside of China's borders. So we're embarking on a global censorship regime, one.
That's a virtual wall, right?
It is a virtual wall. It is a virtual wall. And two is they're pioneering what a lot of people are starting to call techno-authoritarianism, using tools that they're pioneering within their own borders, facial recognition technology, audio recognition technology that they're using to build what they're calling social credit scores, databases of all individuals, so they can then rank how loyal you are to the party, and then you get societal benefits based on that. And they are beginning to lay the groundwork to export those kinds of technologies to countries around the world. Some of you may be hearing a lot about the debate on Huawei and 5G, particularly in the European context. I would argue this is not just about telecommunications infrastructure. This is about essentially who's going to control the entire essentially virtual sea lanes for the next century. And that has implications not just for the flow of data and information, that has implications for these very freedoms that we're talking about, who gets to shape the rules of the road. And that is why I think this is an incredibly important issue as we're thinking about, how do we protect democracy as technology continues to evolve? It's got to be democracies that are continuing to set those rules. And if we have authoritarian powers, they're the ones that are setting the rules for how technology is both developed and used and deployed. I think that we've got some real problems for democracy.
I just want to say before we go to the audience, I have been affiliated with and received fellowships from the German Marshall Fund throughout my career. And I just want to say that the Marshall Fund is a pillar of the Transatlantic Alliance. It's a pillar of our free society. And if you get a chance before you leave today, you should thank our guests coming from the GMF. And maybe just, could you say a word about why the GMF exists and the Marshall Plan, the Marshall Fund? Could you just explain this to our audience?
So we were an organization that was created, I believe in the 1970s, out of an initial grant from the German government and the German people in appreciation for the Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Europe after World War II. And so the idea was to have an institution that would embody the spirit of the Marshall Plan and the assistance that the American people provided to Europeans to help rebuild their societies in a very difficult time, to promote continued transatlantic engagement. And it's been interesting. I've been in the Europe space for about 20 years, only at GMF for a year and a half, but to watch GMF evolve too. We used to be a grant-making organization. We still do a little bit of that, but mostly in Europe. A lot of our programs now promote just transatlantic engagement on thorny issues like this, or on issues like the rise of China and what should Americans and Europeans do together to deal with those challenges. And so I'd encourage you to visit our website, gmfus.org. You can see the whole host. We also have fellowship programs for students, for young leaders, and a lot of what we do is not just think tank work and reports like the one we're talking about today, but actual people-to-people engagement, getting Europeans to America and having them travel around and get to understand America, not just attending a conference in Washington and vice versa, taking Americans to Europe. And so you can see the full range of activities on our website.
Yeah, I'll just add one last point on that, which is, for me personally, when, coming out of the 2016 campaign and I was thinking about what to do and where to do it, I knew that being in a place, I had never worked in the think tank world. I was always a government person, a policy person from the inside. But I knew that being at an institution that put values front and center was really important for me in this day and age. I didn't really want to have to be in a place where we had to be careful not to offend certain audiences by holding back on the values piece. That's not about political ideology, of course. That's about, again, taking a side on things like rule of law matters, free markets matter, human rights matter, transatlantic alliances matter, and really proudly taking a side on those values and putting that front and center in our work was something that was really important for me in this time and place.
Okay.
Should we give him a hand?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have a couple of people with microphones around the room. If you'd like to ask a question, if you can raise your hand. Jeff, you want to start over here with this gentleman? If you can just be brief with your questions, tell us your name, and if it's directed to one or other of our guests, but please.
Thank you. My name is Raymond Termini. I direct it to any one of the four of you out there. Is there any value of looking at the Podesta tapes themselves, the Podesta emails? They were clearly damaging to Hillary Clinton and her campaign. However, I have never heard any serious allegation by Clinton or her campaign that they were inaccurate. Don't the American people have a right to know this information?
I think the challenge is, and we've seen this not just in the Podesta case, but in all these other leaks that have happened since, not just from the Russians, but from other actors, like I mentioned, some of the Gulf countries, unfortunately. When you dump a trove of documents of that size through a cutout, essentially, in this case WikiLeaks, no one has time, or and most journalists don't have the technical expertise or ability to figure out what has been manipulated and what is actually factual. And so that's a major concern in any of those cases. It was a problem actually in France as well, in the Macron campaign, which I mentioned earlier, knowing that they were probably at risk, actually went and created a false set of information almost to bait the Russians, and it worked in the sense that when the Russians went after the Macron information and then dumped it, and they dumped it I think 24, 36 hours before the election, a lot of the fake information was out there because the Macron people knew they put fake information in there just to kind of make it easier to defend themselves if this came out. So that's a major problem for journalists because you essentially are at that point, part of an intelligence operation. You don't even know always the ultimate source. You don't know their intention. And traditionally, the way journalists, I think, have tried to operate, I mean, they will take leaks and information in the public interest from a whole host of actors, but an editorial decision is usually made about what is that person's ultimate agenda here. Is it truly a benign agenda of just influencing the public good? Or is something deeper going on here? And I think the frustrating thing for me in 2016 is I don't think enough of those questions were being asked, because early on, many of the journalists and the news organizations that started to publish those emails, they had no clue the Russians were the ones who initially provided it. They didn't know where the information came from. And the scary thing as well, Laura mentioned some of the debates that have been happening in media circles. We've seen again and again, just in the last few months, the similar things play out. We have the Saudis feuding with the Qataris, Saudis and Emiratis in a major dispute with the Qataris. Both sides have been hacking each other's officials' accounts and dumping databases of emails. You had the Emirati ambassador in Washington, his entire email got compromised. Thousands of emails were leaked, and people just run stories on these things without stopping to think, is this in the public interest? What's the ultimate agenda here? Were any of the emails manipulated? It's partly because of our broader media culture and the reliance on social media, where we now, as a society, seem to think that every piece of information is fair game without that editorial line or that editorial set of decisions being made. So I think you can debate whether some things in the Podesta email were newsworthy or not, but I think the frustrating...
His risotto recipe wasn't.
Well, there was a lot of that too. I mean, I don't know if you remember the New York, I think it was even the New York Times who ran a story about his risotto recipe. You know, I think that at the end of the day, the news organizations should be much more cautious about potentially being manipulated, especially when there's a link to a foreign intelligence organization.
Can I just add 2 points on that? On the Gulf case that Jamie mentioned, folks may remember this was early on in the Trump administration, but this actually led to real policy questions and actually near conflict involving the GCC, and Qatar was kind of kicked out, and there was this whole series of cascades of actions. But what ended up becoming clear at the end was that the nub of what set off this whole debate within the GCC was actually a false story that had been planted in one of the set of hacked emails. So things were hacked, they were given to a journalist, false information was implanted in there, and that nearly led to conflict. So we're talking about literally questions of war and peace. we're talking, I think Jamie and I are concerned about these tactics because they have a direct impact on our democracy, but they have also a very direct impact on our security, and our free and open press is being used as a tool of potentially manipulating not just how we talk with each other, but literally how we use our tools of military power.
Okay. Well, let's go to Louisa here up here in the front, Jeff, in the pink sweater.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Louise. I'm with the Tower Center. So a question, I haven't read the report, and we talked about civil society. Lindsay built a little bit into where I was going to on college campuses. But isn't it also that we are more likely to be threatened by authoritarian states because our education system has fallen behind? I mean, we can't build civil society without an educated society, and we see that we're lagging behind. So how do we address at a younger age in our education system that is still a value, that it can help us discern information, not attack each other when a Facebook post comes up? So did you address that? Did we look at education, K-12, as a critical piece for democracy?
It's not something, it's a great question. It's not something we dove into ourselves directly, in part because I always am mindful of what I know and don't know, and I'm a national security wonk, and as much as I believe deeply in K-12 education, it's not a policy space that I know as well. But we did, of course, talk about the breakdown in numerous components of whether it's our education system, or whether it's more broadly in how we consume information. So I do think that certainly media literacy, digital literacy, and as I mentioned earlier, civic education, right? Really understanding the role of citizens in democracies, right? We all have to play a role in this, and sitting it out really isn't an option. I suppose it is an option, but that's certainly a choice, right? And it's one that's not necessarily going to be in furtherance of democracy. So it's something I think we would love to actually continue to expand on, for sure.
We've looked a little bit into, there's some interesting pilot projects in certain European countries to tackle this problem, where they've really focused on starting to educate young people about media literacy and how to consume news and information, and how to have some internal editorial judgment when you see something online, to question it, to look at the source, to think about what ultimately is the agenda of that person. We love now, ever since we hosted him at an event, to quote a Texas Congressman, Will Hurd, I think who's from further south, who at an event that we did, he described it as online stranger danger. We teach our kids, and I've got 2 young kids, to don't talk to strangers, don't get in their car, don't go up to them at the mall. Why don't we teach them the same thing online? The reality is, certainly children should not be engaging strangers online, but even most Americans. If you're gonna have political debates online, try to figure out that the person you're engaging with is actually real. They exist, that they're not a bot, that they're not sitting in St. Petersburg. Start asking some of those questions. So I think that's a major focus that needs to be explored more. Although, honestly, when you look at kind of the target audiences of some of this, I'm not entirely sure that young people are worse off. I have a 67-year-old mother, and just watching her activity on Facebook, and she's not pushing Russian propaganda at me, but some of the conspiracy theories I have seen her push, where you see some of these things that circulate where people make comments about, well, why is my Facebook account not showing as many of my friends' content? Or these scams, retweet this or post this story and get 5 of your friends to do it. That stuff circulates widely amongst much more educated, older consumers of information. So I don't think the problem is entirely at K through 12, but we need to start there.
Yeah. Let's go over to this side of the room. Yes, ma'am. Mike's behind you.
Thank you. Dear Williams, 2 quick comments. First, I'm a Tower Center member, but I'm also a German Marshall Fellow. So
great.
just a little anecdote. When I went on my fellowship, we had the opportunity to meet with NATO. And this was in 2002, so I'm dating myself. But at the time, the talk was, even meeting with NATO officials, of having Russia join NATO. And not until 2014 was the alliance or the cooperation between NATO and Europe sort of shut down. So that was just the anecdote I wanted to share. But the question I had was, you talked about the Chinese firewall, but you didn't mention the Russian firewall. The Guardian mentioned last week that Putin is considering shutting down the global internet within Russia. Can you talk about how that would toward our cybersecurity efforts?
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch this debate about, or this rumor about Putin potentially shutting down the internet within Russia. And analysts have differing views about A, whether that's really possible, B, if that's actually something that they're going to do versus just kind of putting out there something they may do. Most of the analysis I've seen, is that if their attempt is to unplug in order to demonstrate that they can survive without the outside, that's actually going to be a self-defeating kind of thing. And so I'm not entirely clear, and I don't know how much if Jamie has other thoughts following this, but I'm not entirely clear of exactly where Putin's going to go with that, and if it's something he's really going to do versus this is just kind of some messaging. But what I would say, kind of taking one step back, and this is where the Russian and the Chinese firewalls kind of come together, is there's a lot of concern. China and now sort of working with Russia, trying to pick up some others globally, is trying to set a whole different set of norms around internet governance, and really in ways that would not only constrain the information space, but could really lead to a balkanized internet. And even Eric Schmidt made headlines, I think, last year by talking about the fact that we may be literally heading for 2 or more different internets with different information realities that are being passed and shaped through those. And I think that is of really deep concern. I think it's pretty clear that we don't want these authoritarian powers setting the rules, which means we're going to continue to set our own rules. But can we actually rally, working with our allies, working with enough like-minded countries around the world? What we need to be able to push back substantially on the ability for China, Russia, others to create a separate, essentially, system. And I think that is going to be a huge, huge question that probably will become clear in the next, I would say, 3 to 5 years about where we're headed there. I think that's a pretty near-term departure point. I don't know if you...
The only thing I'll add is that one frustrating aspect of all of this is the US and Europe are deeply divided on a lot of these digital issues because of the different regulatory environment in Europe. And one of the ways to respond if Russia and China go in that direction is for the US to work more closely with like-minded, whether it's the Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, essentially the democracies, to make sure that we're all on the same page. And one of my fears is that's not even happening right now for broader reasons, both some of the policy disagreements, but then the broader rift in transatlantic relations. And so I think we, as democracies, need to get much more serious about trying to build a coherent common strategy on some of these topics.
Okay. So, let's see. Go to this side. Yes, sir. In the back. Mike's right behind you.
Hi there, thanks for coming again today. And I want to ask a question. You guys talk a lot about defensive measures, but are there any sort of penalties, punishments, or perhaps even offensive measures that the United States should unilaterally or multilaterally pursue?
Bradley, you should introduce yourself.
Oh yes, my name is Bradley Potts, and I'm a senior in Professor Hollifield's class.
He's also a Tower Scholar.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question. It's really important. Yes, we absolutely cannot just be on defense. We've got to move both to a better deterrent posture and a little bit of offense. Now, on the offensive front, a couple things about the way I think about it. One is, and this goes back to your point about preserving our democratic institutions. One of the things that we hear a lot is, well, why don't we just do the same thing, to the Russians that they do to us? Engage in all these information operations, inject fake stories, manipulate their media, all that stuff. My answer to that is, if we engage in a race to the bottom of truth, democracy loses, and Putin wins. Our goal is not just to beat Putin; it's to preserve democracy, it's to strengthen democracy. So I don't believe we should be engaging in offensive information operations that in any way manipulate or undermine truth or democracy. Now, does that mean that things like, other kinds of information that simply just report the facts and expose truth are something we shouldn't do? No, I think we should continue, of course, to do that as we always have. Where I do think we should go more on offense is number one in the cyber domain. And I will give some credit to the administration that this is an area where they have moved in a more forward-leaning posture on cyber operations. It's complicated, and I'm not totally in support of everything they're doing, but the long and short is I think we are moving in a direction where using U.S. Offensive cyber tools is something that we are looking at and then doing a little bit more. And I think that is something that's important. But the other piece of it is, we often get caught in this trap of responding sort of tit for tat or symmetrically. So they do something in cyber, we do something in cyber, they do something in information, we do something in information. I think that we need to be much better when it comes to offense about defining where our strengths are, right? As Jamie said earlier, Putin's playing we can really well. He's using low-cost tools with high impact because they are asymmetrically advantageous to him. How do we turn those tables? Where are our advantages and where are Putin's weaknesses? That's where we really need to be focusing. The biggest one in my book on that is Putin's money. That's what he cares about. It all sits in the West. It sits in London. It sits in banks, in Cyprus. It sits in banks across a bunch of European capitals, and it sits in New York, and Florida, and a couple of other spots in the U.S. And there are a lot of things that we could do to basically dry up Putin's financial flows and really go after him and his network of supporters where it hurts in a way that's more targeted than just sanctions. I mean, I think Jamie and I have broadly been supportive of imposing additional costs, including in terms of sanctions on Russia. But the challenge there is, Putin has actually been able to skate by pretty well with the existing sanctions regime, even where it's hurt the Russian people, by being able to blame the external boogeyman, us. And so how do we go after Putin and his cronies in a more targeted way that helps to split him from the Russian people, right? It doesn't drive him and the Russian people, closer together.
So we should not lead with our chin, is that what you're saying?
I think we need to be smart and calculating, and sometimes blunt force is not exactly the best way to go. I think we have, if we're smart, it requires a lot of coordination. If you do read our report, one of the things we talk a lot about is the fact that our governments aren't organized right to deal with these issues. We don't have the right kinds of coordination bodies that can pull together all the different levels of power to be able to execute well on these kinds of sophisticated strategies that actually require real coordination thought. We've got to do a lot more of that so that we're smart. Right now, we just reach for, we've got a hammer, everything's a nail, and that's, when we actually decide to take action on this stuff, that's basically what we do, and it's just not smart.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is the deterrent posture, and that's what I think we're very concerned about, although we're in a much better place organizationally, I think, within the government than we were when 2016 played out. There's more societal awareness about this problem. I worry that we've basically now, as a country, decided to accept this new normal where authoritarians feel that they can try to insert themselves into our democracy, and we're just going to kind of deal with it and move on. I think that's it's dangerous across the board, but it's especially dangerous in the long-term challenge vis-a-vis China, because as Laura noted, they're playing a long game. I think the Chinese are also, as we've seen things like the trade war and the other engagement this administration's had with the Chinese are very sensitive, certain pressure nodes. If they think that certain tools are off limits and will provoke a massive US response, it's more likely that they will not use some of those tools. I don't think we're there yet at all in terms of our messaging about this problem. What we've seen through 2018, we saw a lot of congressional debate in the run-up to the midterms. We saw various pieces of legislation introduced that would have actually put in place formal triggers. So a formal assessment process. After each election, you would have the intelligence and DHS officials look at the election that just passed. They would make an assessment of whether there was foreign interference. If there was, there would be automatic sanctions that would kick in. There have been various bills like that had bipartisan support. They haven't passed yet. The administration tried to do a version of that with an executive order, but as we've now seen, it's actually quite weak. We've seen an administration assess the midterms and say, yes, multiple countries tried to interfere in our elections, but we haven't really decided yet. It wasn't the voter rolls, it wasn't the actual infrastructure, so maybe it was low level, but we haven't decided yet even to impose any sanctions. So I think from a deterrent perspective, that is the worst message to send, because all of the what the administration now is basically referring to as low-level interference, was playing out every day on social media on almost every major political topic. You had foreign actors inserting themselves, fanning the flames of division, spreading conspiracy theories. I personally don't want that to be the new normal, so I think we need to get to the point where we build in some sort of mechanism to respond, whether it's sanctions, whether it's better targeting of sanctions, that is almost automatic, because you need to take the politics out of it too, which was part of the concern in 2016 when the Obama administration started to see signs of this. They were very worried about being accused by Republicans in the Trump campaign of announcing certain things for political reasons. And so we need to kind of make this a nonpartisan, automatic response when our democracy is threatened in this way. And so there are some things, I think, legislatively that still need to happen in that space.
We are just about out of time. We don't tend to. We finish our events on time here at the Bush Center. I'd like to call on Holly Kuzmich, the Executive Director of the Bush Institute and Vice President of the Bush Center, to say a few words. She's coming up front, though, just to express my appreciation to all of you, to our panelists today. Special shout out to my colleagues Chris Walsh and Megan Best for their efforts on this event, and Laura Lacey from the Tower Center. We appreciate all of that.